keep running. Let's see what happens.
Right, let's have your Xinjiang question. Oh no, I'll tell you what, I'll put my audio on as well. We can share the two things together. I don't know how long it'll last, maybe half an hour it might last, I don't know. Yeah, forgot it. No, well, we got that.
Yep.
Okay, doke. What was your question, sir?
Well,
When no one's around.
Yeah,
I'm not a regular.
It's recorded though.
I'm not a regular with you. I know you study China a lot.
It's my
It's your main thing, isn't
Well,
it?
one of my main
So there's
subjects.
various questions about human rights and, what I'm talking about.
It's a big subject nowadays, so
I just wonder what your take on it is, particularly the Uyghurs and other religious groups. Just focus on that. Falun Gong.
Chinese government, I have argued over many years, has certain unique characteristics to it. Starting with the fact that the Communist Party in China maintained power when the Soviet Union and other countries in Eastern Europe collapsed. And my own investigation into that subject matter began because I was a believer in the transformation of the socialist, so-called socialist world into a democratic socialist system. But having analysed the nature of China over the last 30 years, I came to the conclusion that the structure of the economic system in China, based on public ownership of the commanding, the decisive levers of power, and private participation in the economy on a very large scale, is actually the best economic methodology for development of the economy. Now, as the Chinese economy developed and sped up its development, we witnessed the fastest economic growth over the last 30 years of any country in human history. The Chinese Communist Party, and I'm going to sometimes use just explanations that explain their own logic. It doesn't mean I agree with what they're doing, but it explains the logic and method that they are applying. And then you can work out how to approach, how you individually and how I approach those questions. China has sought to develop its economy, to raise the living standards in order to pacify the urban or the newly urban masses. They've raised 600 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years. No other country, no other region has ever been able to achieve such a rapid rate of growth. So the starting point of the argument of the Chinese Communist Party is that our human rights conception starts from raising the living standards of the people. So that's the first fundamental criteria that they apply to analysing issues like human rights and democracy. Rightly or wrongly, and I'll go into that if you like a little bit later. Having raised the living standards dramatically in the eastern seaboard, Shenzhen, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Beijing, all the eastern seaboard cities, and moved westwards into the interior of China, they have now reached the point where they're expanding their modernization program into an ancient area governed by deserts and arid lands where the Muslim Uyghurs live. Xinjiang, a huge area of China. There are 11 million Uyghurs living in Xinjiang. Over the last 30 years, there was also factually based, evidence-based, a program by Saudi Wahhabis to promote Wahhabism inside Xinjiang, the province of China, and amongst the Uyghurs, advocating an independent Turkestan. This was an ancient civilization. The Turkic people, they lived from Mongolia until Turkey. In fact, Turkey was not really a Turkic area, it was occupied later. But there's a long history of Turkic people and Chinese people, Han Chinese people, and of the integration and separation between them. The Chinese government sees the development of Xinjiang as in the same way as they see the development of Shanghai, of Guangzhou, of Shenzhen and other. 30, 40 years ago, Shenzhen was a village. The people had all sorts of superstitions, worshipped all sorts of gods. But over 30 years, it became one of the most advanced modern cities in the world, if not the most advanced. In technology, it's challenging or replacing Silicon Valley in California at this moment. In fact, most Silicon Valley companies, if they want to really innovate, they base themselves in Shenzhen. So it's within that context you have to understand how the Chinese government is approaching the issue of Islam and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. They believe that within 5 years, Xinjiang will be one of the most modern cities, or better said, Urumqi will be one of the most modern cities in the world. And so their method, just the same as with the education and organisation of migrant workers from the countryside moving to the cities, they generally, when they first move to the cities, they're put into barrack-like workplaces. For example, in Dongguan, in southern China, there are 250,000 people who live in a single workplace, producing the iPhones, the Samsungs, the Sony, all these phones you've got in your pocket. The chances are 90% of them are produced in a factory in Dongguan with 250,000 people there. In those factories, people live in shared accommodation, but they also receive education. They have cinemas, they have education centres, they have training, and they jump out from a peasant existence similar to 300, 400 or 500 years ago into the modern world. They learn the modern language, the modern Han Chinese Pudonghua language, or dialect better said. Whereas they might have come from a village where they only spoke, Hubei Hua or Shanghai Hua or, Guangdong Hua. And therefore, to integrate together the people, they consider it as an administrative mechanism to raise them to the next level of economic. That's how they view it.
Administrative, you're wiping out the Islamic religion. That's not administrative.
One minute.
That's genocide.
It is not true that they're wiping out the Islamic religion. They are, however, what they did was they said, we will train up these people to enter the modern world and we will create the infrastructure of a modern city. And their calculation is, rightly or wrongly, that about 90% of the population will go along with this. And maybe 10%, certainly with the Islamic fundamentalists amongst them, and the East Turkestan independence movement amongst them, backed by America, by the way, and backed by Saudi Arabia, they believe they can isolate these people by training the masses in Xinjiang to be part of the modern world. That is the approach of the Chinese government.
It's an atheist regime suppressing the
It is an
religious
atheist
views.
regime.
And it's a religious domination of atheists, like we've seen in Russia under Stalin and elsewhere, where they persecute and suppress the priests or imams and so on. We've seen this before in the Soviet Union, we've seen it before in Eastern Europe. This is the same old communist takeover and suppression of independent thought and indigenous religious expression, be it Christian or Muslim, whatever. This is appalling, and I'm very unhappy that this Communist Party is still in power. It hasn't gone the way of the former Soviet Union.
Why hasn't it?
It needs to, because it's out of step with modern ideas of freedom and respect for other people's views.
Well,
this
firstly,
is not modern. This is reactionary.
Are they as free as yourself? That you could stand up and say what you say? Are they as free as yourself? Where they could stand and say whatever they like?
That's a reasonable question, and certainly no.
Yeah.
Well, there you are. That's not modern.
Were they in the Soviet Union? No. Were they in Hungary or in East Germany?
That's
No.
not modern. More
I
Western.
did. I went to East Germany in 1989, 88 actually, and I did underground work in East Germany. I moved into East Germany. I worked to support the opposition, which I believe was. I worked to support the Marxist opposition inside East Germany to overthrow the government. Now, I did so at risk to myself and in submission of my own freedom to fight for what I believed would be the freedom of others. However, the argument as you presented, I don't want to misrepresent what you said, but just make sure that, catch me out if I do so, but I don't believe I am. You're basically arguing a parallel, and the argument you're making is the same, is that the parallel can be directly drawn between the freedom in the West and the repression of religion in Xinjiang, because they don't have this freedom. Whereas in reality, although we have freedom to speak in Hyde Park, we actually only have this freedom because it is relatively meaningless. As soon as the freedoms that we have become a general challenge to the powers that be, the question of maintaining that freedom is brought up. Let me give you an example of what this means. It means that although officially in Britain we have freedom of religion, freedom of belief, freedom of expression, simultaneous and integral to that so-called freedom is Operation Iraqi Freedom. And Operation Iraqi Freedom entailed the death of over 1 million Iraqis to establish a regime in the image of America and Britain, although they failed, and they actually promoted religious extremism in Iraq. The consequence of their action was, I'll take you both in 1 second, the consequence of the action of America and Britain in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya was to strengthen Islamic fundamentalism, terrorism and violence.
Point of
Not to
order,
do with any of the
we were
questions.
talking about China, and there's plenty of critiques
Because the
to
parallel
make
was
of-
about freedom.
Yeah, I
People
know.
ask me, yes, but you're free. They're not free. That's what they ask. We're free
Well,
here.
Alan's talking
They're
about the
not
war in
there.
Iraq.
Therefore, I
Talking
drew
about
the
freedom.
I
example
wanted to pose some questions
to
to Heiko.
understand in context.
Yeah,
I'll tell you what,
okay.
in a comparative
Let him
context,
say something.
what is happening in China compared
Right.
to what happens in the free West.
First question. At the beginning, you said you were going to outline the situation as the Chinese Communist Party sees it, not necessarily
Which I
your
did.
viewpoint.
I did.
So I'd like to hear your take on the situation as you've described, using your value judgments as a British citizen living in this quasi-free whatever. And the other question I like, which has always puzzled me for some time, which is that in their own minds, where does the CCP leadership see the ultimate, or not ultimate, but the direction of travel? Do they see it as a sort of liberal democracy, or do they see it as something else we haven't even conceived of, or what? So is the current state a sort of transitional thing in their own minds, which might be excusable if they have a sort of a plan, or, you know, say in 50 years or something, to open things up, or not? Is there an eternity of
In the
control
history of
and-
communism and the history of Marxism, just the same as in the history of Islam and the history of Christianity and the history of liberalism, republicanism, socialism, social democracy. There are different strands within it. I, of course, standing up here as a preacher of this belief system, believe that I interpret it correctly. You know, why else would I stand up here? And my interpretation is that Marxism as a method of understanding the world is the most precise and accurate method for doing so. And therefore I analyse the regime in China as I used to analyse the regime in East Germany, which I supported overthrowing, and I did active work to overthrow it, but that doesn't mean I supported what happened. I opposed German unification, and I opposed the restoration of capitalism. In China, I stand with the Communist Party in opposing the restoration of capitalism. And if you ask what the belief system of the Chinese Communist Party is, it's quite simple. It's communism. All members of the Communist Party have to swear their allegiance to the belief in communism. Now, how they interpret the path to communism and how I interpret the path to communism are different. I believe that the working class, which has on paper, in legislation in China, the right to administer the entire economy democratically, it's in the enterprise law of China, allows all workers to elect their managers. I agree with this. Now, the Communist Party declares it agrees with it, but it doesn't actually implement it. Because the history of the Chinese Communist Party is one of an administrative hierarchy forged in a civil war lasting 22 years from 1927 to 1949. That's when the Communist Party founded its identity and its character. And because it was founded by a guerrilla war, the character of the party became like the character of an army, a bureaucratic hierarchy controlling society and organising things as if they were an army. Now, I believe in a different type of socialism, and that is socialism a la Karl Marx, which means that the working class, in other words, those who sell their labour power for a wage and work in modern sectors of the economy, will themselves administer society and organise that society democratically in advance of the creation of a genuine communist society across the entire world.
So in that sense,
Muslims in China, you haven't addressed that point at all.
What's that?
Yeah. About the plight of Muslims being persecuted by.
Well, I have addressed it. I've said
Your
firstly.
own view.
Yeah, you said the view of the Chinese
Right.
Communist
Your-
Party.
Oh, sorry.
My first part
Well,
was
I
my
believe
second
I
question.
believe that the
You've
people.
answered the second part. Of my
Right,
question.
okay, just
The first
on-
part was your own reflections on the
Okay,
situation as it is.
okay.
And-
As
and-
regards the Uyghurs, in general, the Communist Party of China, because it came out of this hierarchical organisation of a military struggle over 22 years, like Cuba did, like Vietnam did, like North Korea did, and by the way, it's not an accident that it is those countries within the so-called communist world that survived. Those that had had a prolonged civil war in advance of the revolutionary seizure of power, those are the ones that survived, and the ones that fell were the ones that had, well, the Russian Revolution and then the spread of revolution by armed invasion of another country. Now, as a general rule, and this began what the Marxists call the national question, which is also a question of religion. At the time when Lenin was still alive, a conflict broke out with Joseph Stalin. Because Joseph Stalin, I'm trying to answer quickly. I'll take you one. Sorry, quick.
We know history. We want to talk about.
Well, I think it's important to understand where this came from to understand what the policy
We
is.
know where it came from.
Well, I don't think.
But
We
So
don't
what was I
all
going to
know where
say?
it came from.
What was I going to say? I was going to say Lenin believed that Stalin should be removed from power because he used his power in a purely administrative way to overthrow the rulers in Georgia. Lenin believed that the people should be able themselves to decide how they administer. And therefore, I believe that the Uyghurs should have the right to organize their own socialist state within China, run by themselves. Now, that of course is not what's going to happen, but that's what I believe would be the right policy to approach in relation to the minorities and the religions in China. Because otherwise, even if they achieve their objective of winning over 90% of the Uyghurs, which I think they probably will do. Why? Because living standards will be raised from peasants to modern urban populations. And in those, sorry?
Is there any truth in the sterilisation
Well, I mean, in every area of China, there are family planning committees.
Family planning committee.
Well, there are.
Call it a
I'm just telling you what
family
there is.
planning committee.
You might sound awful,
Family
but there are.
planning committee. Committees that decide whether people can breed.
Effectively, yes.
That is
That's
a major
eugenics,
worry.
practically,
It's
isn't
not
it? You know,
eugenics.
that's awful.
It's not eugenics. It's
It's
like
not how humans live, is it?
well, it's
Family
how
planning
it's how we
committee.
live in Britain at the moment, isn't
we
it? We've
don't.
got
We have
lockdowns,
nothing
we've got
approachable
regulations,
because we don't
we've
have
got
a limit on
instructions, we've
children,
got
we don't
police
have a
enforcing
limit on-
them.
That's not
We're not
family
allo-
planning
We have to
committee.
put on things
Same
when we
at
go
all.
into shops. It's
It's not
not
the
that
same as
different.
telling us when we can breed.
What
or
they
not.
were saying was, and this wasn't just from the Chinese, the United Nations and other international institutions, they all used to say in the 1970s, there's a real danger, there will be overpopulation and countries will not be able to cope economically with the demands on the society. And one of the reasons why the Chinese, rightly or wrongly, imposed family planning upon the whole of China was so that China would be developed unlike India. India, you've seen in the last few months, has suffered a catastrophic collapse, not only in the economy, but in the lives of the masses of India. Only last year, people were claiming India's going to be like China. It's growing faster, it's democratic, it's got its own Silicon Valley, it will overtake China. So they said. But now you see what the reality is. When the lockdown came, 150 million people were driven out of the cities with batons and tasers. They were sprayed on and poisoned and died on the road. And the life around the world, not just in India, according to the United Nations now,
Well, there's a few in.
some 240 million people are being driven into starvation conditions since the crisis of March this year. So you have to contextualize the question of family planning within that context. Of course, it is true that the more developed an economy becomes, the lower the birth rate is. And so what has happened just now in China, that people are screaming about the Uyghurs are having forced sterilization, is what the Chinese have done now is, they've said, because they always had a policy that if you're a minority religion or you're a minority population, a national grouping, there are 50 odd different national groupings in China. If you're one of the national groupings or religious minorities, you are allowed to have more children than the Han Chinese. So the family planning policy did not apply in the Uyghur areas. They were allowed to have as many children as they like. But recently, as the Chinese relaxed family planning for the Han Chinese, and they allowed Han Chinese people in the cities to have 2 children and in the country to have 3 children, they now move that same regulation that's applicable to the Han Chinese onto the Uyghur population as well. So now the Uyghurs have the same regulation, they don't have any advantage. They used to be advantaged compared to the Han Chinese. That no longer is the case.
You're just talking, you are ignoring the basic human need, which is freedom. I'm an atheist myself, but I'm not a communist. I believe in freedom, and I've been here 48 years, and basically I come from a country which was at war at the time, and I know exactly what it means to be free. I go to my country every year. I come here, walk everywhere I like, with no problems. You walk really happy. In my country, which was better than this country at the time, 100 times. Now, when I go every year in Lebanon, yeah, every year I go to Lebanon, when I walk in the streets, I feel, it's in my head, I'm sure it's mine, nobody's following me, but I feel being followed. People, the basic human need is freedom. All the rest is rubbish. All the politics are rubbish. The
problem is this. When you say what you say,
yeah,
human need is freedom, politics is rubbish, and so on.
I'd
Freedom
prefer
is the
to
key.
starve in
When you
freedom.
say that, you haven't clarified what you mean by freedom.
Freedom, walking in the streets. Where
Walking in the streets you can do anywhere in the world,
No, come on.
apart from Manchester.
And all the communists.
Not if you're a woman as
And
well,
in
that's
China,
true.
mate. And in
Although
China.
you can, but you're in danger.
And in China. You know,
Well, that's not true in China.
Just a minute.
Well, how is it true?
Just,
Anyone can walk in the
don't
street
you
in
remember?
China.
Of course, everybody can walk.
So what do you mean by freedom?
What I mean by freedom is when you walk down the street and you feel that nobody is following you, nobody cares about, you're free.
That's a relative question, my friend.
It's not a relative at all. I tell you
It's
what.
a relative question. Firstly,
have you forgotten? No.
I have the freedom to express my point of view, but I
Where?
have no doubt.
Here.
I have no doubt
Can you do that in
whatsoever
China?
that the Secret Services monitor my communications
No, of course,
and
of course.
keep tabs on me.
So
I have no doubt whatsoever.
No problem. But at least
I would if I were them too.
I wouldn't mind here because I know that we have a fair justice system in England.
But you were wrong.
No,
we do
no,
not
no.
have a fair justice
No, I
system.
do.
In England, we have a justice system crafted around the defence of the wealthiest.
Okay,
That's the justice system we
okay,
have.
fair enough.
It's
Let's
not a
talk about
justice
something
system.
else.
It's
You
a
were
system
talking
designed
about
to
Iraq.
defend the wealth and privileges of the wealthy and powerful.
You're talking about Iraq.
Sorry?
You were talking about Iraq and the million that died, which
Oh,
I
I'm
agree.
asking you about freedom.
Yeah,
Okay,
but the
let's
Secret
go back,
Service
okay.
might be monitoring you, but they're not going to do anything about you, Stanley.
That's right.
So, you're being left free.
Well, what do you mean do something about?
Well,
Well, there's nothing to
basically,
do. What I'm saying is because you are
you just
Well, that's
you're
not
being
true.
free,
You just don't
If
understand.
any of you use Facebook over the last couple of months,
Yes.
since the lockdown started,
Yes.
Facebook contained and controlled
Yes.
who you had access to
Yeah.
and who saw what you
Yeah,
posted.
Okay, but
They're
that's
talking about you being observed.
And well, you says Mark Zuckerberg is not. In
Operating
each,
under the
in
control
each
of-
country,
He's not
in
controlled
each
because they're watching
country,
him now,
the
is he?
regulations were imposed in different ways. In other words, the national governments connected together with the social media services to control the dissemination of ideas. And I've had that personally. I've sent messages to people,
let's say
for
something
example,
here.
recordings of me speaking at Speaker's Corner. I've sent that to people, or tried to send that to people, using Facebook, and it comes back and says, this is in breach of community guidelines.
My
A
neighbour-
personal message
Yeah, but that's
from one
Facebook-
person
that's
to
Facebook
another.
You want to try
Guidelines.
V-Contact
It's
next
not
time, you
Facebook
probably
guidelines, it's guidelines introduced by government policy who are saying anything that does not agree with their point of view about the crisis developing in the world today has to be in some way corralled and contained in a certain box.
yeah.
So it is with demonstrations.
But they don't drag
So-
you down the street.
Sorry?
They don't drag you down the street and
Sometimes they
beat
drag
the
you down the
no,
street.
No, 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 not here.
I've had my
Come
head
on.
smashed open by wooden sticks
by police?
police officers
Why?
in Germany,
In
and
Germany?
I've been arrested
In
many
Germany?
times
Here I'm
in
talking,
Britain.
here, not in
I've been
Germany.
arrested in Britain for speaking on the streets. I have been arrested for doing
Okay,
that.
that's no problem.
I've been
but
arrested
did they?
at Speaker's
Causing
Corner
Okay,
for speaking here.
did they torture
So it's
you?
not-
Did they torture you? Did they-
Turkey's the biggest
Now you're talking about torture. I'm asking you
Yeah.
to define freedom.
I'll define
because
freedom
you
for you.
made freedom
Yeah.
elevated it to the,
It's the most
the
it's the
central
basic
nexus
instinct
to
that a
define
human being
humanity.
should have.
How
is no
much
freedom.
freedom
There
do
is no
you
freedom.
have?
There
How
is no
much
freedom.
freedom do you have if you cannot pay for medicine and you are sick?
Turkey's
Sorry?
funding ISIS.
How much freedom? No, not here. How much? Let's say in India. Or in South Africa. How much freedom do you have if you do not have the money for medicine you need to live?
We're talking about this
Is that a
country.
restriction on
Wait,
freedom?
we haven't-
Is it a restriction on freedom?
We haven't moved it. We're talking about this country first, yeah?
Well, we're
Let's
talking
finish.
about this country.
Yeah.
How much freedom do the 65,000 people who died as a result of government policy have?
Come on, they've done a lot better
In Vietnam,
than the Chinese.
they have a larger population than Britain, 120 million. They've had 2 deaths.
Where?
We have had 65,000 deaths
Where?
since March.
Where?
Vietnam.
Vietnam.
Now, Vietnam, according to your criteria, quite correctly, is not as free as Britain.
Yeah, but
But
you
that
believe
means,
that.
in consequence of the current situation, that
you
means
believe
the
that?
Vietnamese had less freedom to die of COVID-19.
Do you
And the
believe that?
British had more freedom to die from COVID-19.
no.
More freedom, by the way,
You're wrong.
than any other country on earth.
They had, yes, Britain had freedom to
Freedom
state,
to die.
to state how many died.
You need
Vietnam.
to state how many died. What utter rubbish, my
Just,
friend. Utter
you're
rubbish.
talking rubbish.
So the
You know
country with the highest death rate must be the freest country. Is that what you're saying?
You're ignoring the
What are
point.
you saying then?
What I'm saying is the government is giving you 2, but there could be 2 million
The
dead.
government's giving us what?
What, you said 2 or 100 or 1,000?
You have no evidence for that. You're sucking out your thumb. It's not an argument.
What
You've got
about
no
China?
evidence for it.
What about China?
China as
Have
well.
you- have you
China
met-
nearly 4,000 deaths.
China had
4,000
millions
dead
dead.
with
Millions
13
dead.
times the population of Britain.
In China,
13 times the population of Britain, 4,000 deaths. Britain, 65 million population, 65,000
because
deaths.
the British government tells you the truth. While the
What truth did they tell you? What did they say 2 days ago?
Come on.
He came on telly, he says, hands, wash your hands. There is no reason to wash your hands.
You just don't
Do not
understand.
catch coronavirus from your hands.
You are.
There are almost no cases around the world that have been shown to come from the hands.
Yeah, let me tell-
And yet the British government, like Lady Macbeth, wants you washing your hands all the time because it's psychological manipulation
Okay.
of the people, entering your brain and making your physical practice into something strange, weird and surreal. Second thing,
I know
they are
that-
telling you, they have been telling you said they're telling us the truth. Where's the truth in it? They don't have any evidence that people are catching coronavirus from
millions in
touching
China are
things.
dying. Millions.
What?
In China, millions are dying.
So you just invent stories.
No, I don't.
You don't have an argument.
It's just the government.
You just want to invent
the
stories.
Chinese. And you say you're annoyed about the British government.
I'm annoyed about having an argument with someone who's not prepared to argue on the terrain of the knowledge they have, and instead of this wants to argue on the mystical ideas being circulated by the American government, supposedly the kings of freedom, and the president of America doesn't even want the elections to happen in America, and yet when the Chinese stop the elections in Hong Kong, they want to invade Hong Kong. What sort of truth do you believe in from the freedom lovers? And these people now say we must prepare for war against China. China's the country that showed the world how to stop coronavirus. Had we emulated them, we wouldn't have had any dead. But instead of this, we sat around saying what we need to do is wash our hands and sing happy birthday twice over. Now the country, only 2 weeks ago, they relaxed the lockdown. And now they're back to lockdown. And before you know it, London will be locked down again as well. All because of the idiocy, stupidity and lies of the government. Not the truth, the lies of the government. And these lies, don't forget, have cost 65,000 dead and rising.
You see, you just want to talk.
So much
You don't
for our
want to listen.
freedom.
You don't want to listen to anybody.
Because you're not saying anything of any validity.
That's what I think.
Stick to what you know, not what you invent.
What I know is you live in you're lucky to be born in this country and you live in a freedom country. You don't know what it means to live in a country where you're.
Well, I have lived in East Germany under the old regime, and I lived in China. I have lived in China.
Did you stand like this and talk?
I did stand up.
Come on!
I was the first person.
Now you're
I
lying.
was the first person to
Now you're
stand
talking
up
rubbish.
in Berlin and have an open air platform in the main square of Berlin, Alexanderplatz, on the 12th of December 1989. And that's recorded, by the way.
Yeah. They didn't drag you.
I spoke against the government.
Yeah, what happened?
Nothing happened.
Oh yeah.
One guy who was pro-government got kicked in the balls by an anarchist. That's what happened.
Yeah, but okay.
Later, 1 month later, in January 1990, I stood up in the same place and I was physically attacked by neo-Nazis. That's the reality of the freedom. I've stood up here when the neo-Nazis came down here. They also attacked me. Right? So it's not true that you just have freedom. It's not true.
There's a difference between organized, like the government organized authority and the people.
I'm not denying that.
Sorry?
I'm not denying that.
Yeah, that's what I mean. You're saying that the anti-Nazis or whatever. I don't care about them because they're
Well, I
idiots.
do, because they're the ones who can limit my freedom.
Okay, no, the government hasn't though. And if the government knew about it, doesn't do something about it. You see, you're talking.
That's what you think.
You see,
The government doesn't give a damn.
but that's what you think.
There's a lot of evidence for that, my friend.
Just a minute.
They talk about freedom.
You're lucky enough to be born in this country.
Oh, you just keep
don't-
repeating yourself, my friend.
Because you don't understand.
No, you keep repeating
just
yourself.
don't
You're wasting my
understand.
time. You're wasting everybody's time.
Oh, you just don't understand.
You've got too het up. You've got too wound up. So you're no longer dealing with the substance of the argument. I can tell you what you're going to say again. You're going to say, you were lucky to be born in this country. You've got freedom. You don't understand what freedom is. You've got freedom. You're lucky to be born in this country. We have freedom. You can speak. You can walk down the street. I mean, it's just repeating like a bloody broken record.
We have a question here.
Yes. Yes, my friend.
I wanted to ask you regarding the Muslims in China. I think part of it is that the Chinese
Why don't you
have
go to
looked
China?
at...
What are you doing here? Why do you go to China?
Is that a relevant question?
Yes, it is.
It's not.
Because you seem to love it.
The Chinese have looked at the surrounding countries. So, for example, in the Philippines, there was a Muslim uprising against the government in the Philippines. There was Muslim uprisings in Burma and
Let me move a little bit over. We've started 3 meetings over there. Sorry,
So in the Philippines,
Philippines. Yeah.
in the Philippines, there's been a Muslim
Sorry,
uprising for
Hank.
decades, and also in Burma and many other countries. And they've also looked at Syria and they've looked at other countries. And for them, Islam is a